My sister's wedding had 200 guests, a 6-tier cake, and a police car parked outside before the reception even started. I was the one standing in the parking lot, mascara down my face, security guard 2 feet behind me, watching through the glass doors as my own family pretended not to see me. Nobody came out. Not my mother. Not my aunts. Nobody. And the worst part? I had a gift on that table. I had a speech prepared. I had a dress I paid $400 for. 3 weeks before that wedding, I found a document. One single document. And the moment my sister realized I had seen it, everything changed. The invitation that came in the mail after that? I should have thrown it straight in the bin. Because that wedding was never meant to celebrate her marriage. It was meant to finish me off quietly, in front of everyone we'd ever known, so that I'd be too humiliated to ever ask questions again. She almost pulled it off. Almost. Stay with me, because what happened inside that venue before the police showed up is something I still can't fully explain without my hands shaking. My sister Rachel and I grew up sharing everything. 1 bedroom. 1 bathroom. One mother who worked double shifts and came home smelling like industrial cleaner. We didn't have much, but we had each other. Or at least that's what I believed for 31 years. The first crack didn't appear at the wedding. It appeared the night our father died, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and cold coffee, when Rachel leaned over to me and whispered, "I hope you're not expecting anything." I didn't know what she meant. I let it go. That was my first mistake. Dad had a house. Paid off. No mortgage. 3 acres of land on the edge of town that a developer had been circling for years. Nobody in our family talked about money openly. It was considered vulgar, my mother always said. So when Dad's health started declining 2 years before the wedding, nobody sat down and had the conversation that needed to happen. Nobody except Rachel. Rachel had that conversation. She had it quietly, privately, with Dad's solicitor, while I was the one driving him to chemotherapy every Thursday morning. I found out later she'd visited that office 4 times in the final year of his life. I was never once mentioned. When Dad passed, I was handed a copy of the will at the solicitor's office. Rachel sat across from me in a gray blazer, completely still, watching my face. The house went to her. The land went to her. A savings account I didn't even know existed, gone to her. I received a jewelry box with 3 rings inside and a handwritten note that said, "For my darling girl." That note was addressed to Rachel. It was in the wrong envelope. I still don't know if that was an accident. I didn't fight it immediately. I was grieving. I was exhausted. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Rachel and I spoke on the phone twice in the month after the funeral, short calls, surface level. She never brought up the will. I never pushed. We existed in this polite, suffocating silence that felt like standing on ice and pretending you can't hear it cracking underneath you. Then she announced the engagement. His name was Daniel, property developer, the kind of man who shakes your hand too firmly and laughs too loudly at his own jokes. I met him twice before the engagement, and both times he looked at me like he was calculating something. I told myself I was being paranoid. Rachel seemed happy. I focused on that. I sent a congratulations card, offered to help plan, and genuinely tried to move forward. That was my second mistake. 6 weeks before the wedding, I was clearing out a box of Dad's old paperwork from the storage unit Rachel had asked me to empty. She said there was nothing important in there. Just old bills, old letters, stuff to throw away. I almost did throw it away. I almost didn't open the brown envelope at the bottom of the 3rd box. But something about the way it was sealed, taped shut, corners folded down neatly, felt deliberate. Dad was not a neat man. I opened it. Inside was a letter, dated 14 months before he died. Dad's handwriting, shaky, slow, like it took effort. It was addressed to both of us, Rachel and me, and it outlined a division of the estate that looked nothing like the will that had been filed. Equal shares. Both names. The land split down the middle. I read it 3 times standing under a flickering fluorescent light in that storage unit. My phone had no signal. My hands had gone completely cold. I took a photo of every single page. Then I drove home and said nothing to anyone. The wedding was 6 weeks away, and I had just found the document that would burn everything to the ground. The invitation arrived 9 days after I found that letter. Thick cream envelope, gold lettering, the kind that costs more per unit than most people's weekly grocery bill. Rachel had clearly spent money she hadn't had 6 months ago. I stood at my front door holding it and thought about the 3 acres of land sitting behind Dad's old house, and how a property developer with a too-firm handshake had probably already had it valued twice. I put the invitation on my kitchen counter and didn't open it for 2 days. When I finally did, the first thing I noticed was the seating chart insert. Most wedding invitations don't include that. Rachel had specifically added a small printed card with table assignments. I was on table 11. Rachel's university friends were on table 3. Her future in-laws were on table 2. Our mother was on table 1, right beside the head table. Table 11 was near the back, beside the exit corridor, shared with people whose names I didn't recognize. I checked twice. I wasn't misreading it. I was seated as far from my sister as the room would physically allow. There was no bridesmaid mention, no role, no request for a speech. When we were teenagers, Rachel used to say that when she got married, I'd be standing right beside her. She said it so many times it became one of those things you stop questioning and just file away as fact. I had filed it away for years. Now I was table 11, exit corridor, no speech, no role, name spelled wrong on the seating card, 1 letter off, like I'd been added as an afterthought by someone who'd only heard my name spoken aloud once. I called my mother that evening. She answered on the first ring, which was unusual. I asked her about the seating. She went quiet for just a beat too long before saying Rachel had organized everything herself, and it wasn't worth making a fuss over. I asked her if she'd seen the table assignment. She said she didn't want to get involved. My mother, who had an opinion about everything from supermarket layouts to the correct way to fold towels, suddenly didn't want to get involved. I got off the phone quickly. Something about her voice felt rehearsed. 2 days later, Rachel called me. First time in 3 weeks. She asked if I'd received the invitation, bright and breezy, like we were fine, like nothing had shifted between us. I said yes. She asked if I was coming. I said yes. She said, "Wonderful, it's going to be a beautiful day." And then she said something that lodged itself in my chest like a splinter. She said, "Just come and enjoy it, don't make it complicated." I hadn't said a single complicated thing. I hadn't mentioned the letter. I hadn't mentioned the will. I hadn't mentioned anything. And she was already telling me not to make it complicated. I almost confronted her that night. I had the photo of Dad's letter pulled up on my phone, thumb hovering. I put it down. I told myself the wedding wasn't the place. I told myself I'd wait until after, find a solicitor, do it properly, protect myself. What I didn't account for was that Rachel wasn't waiting. Rachel was already moving. The phone calls I wasn't part of, the conversations I wasn't in, they had already been happening for weeks. Everyone in that family circle had already been told a version of events. A version that didn't include Dad's letter. A version where I was the problem. I RSVP'd yes. I bought the $400 dress. I wrote a speech I never got to give. And I walked straight into something that had been built specifically to make sure I'd never walk out of it with my dignity intact. There was a group chat. I found out about it 3 days before the wedding, completely by accident, the way you find out about most things that were deliberately kept from you. My cousin Diane called me to confirm what time I was arriving at the venue. Casual call, quick question. But Diane talked the way people do when they're nervous, too fast, too much, filling silence before it forms. She mentioned the family group chat without thinking. Then she stopped herself. Then she laughed too quickly and changed the subject. I let her change it. Then I sat very still after we hung up and thought about every family member who had my number and had not texted me directly in over a month. I was not in that group chat. I knew it immediately, the way you know a room went quiet because of you before you walked in. Someone had built a family communication channel for the wedding and removed me from it, or never added me at all. Reception details, arrival times, dress codes, coordination for photographs. All of it happening in a conversation I had no access to. I texted 3 relatives separately that evening with a simple question about parking at the venue. All three gave me different answers. All three answers were wrong. I looked up the venue myself online and found the correct car park information in under 4 minutes. They weren't just excluding me, they were feeding me wrong information. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay there running backwards through the last 2 months, reassembling things I dismissed. Rachel's short phone calls. My mother's careful non-answers. The cousin who had suddenly stopped liking my social media posts after years of never missing one. The aunt who had always called me on my birthday, and this year sent a text at 11 p.m. instead. Individually, each thing was nothing. Together, in the dark at 2 in the morning, they formed a shape I didn't want to look at directly. The next morning I called Diane back. I didn't accuse her of anything. I just said, "Diane, I need you to be honest with me, because I think something is going on and I'd rather hear it from you than walk into it blind." Silence. Then she exhaled. Then she said, "I can't get in the middle of this." Those 6 words told me everything. You don't say I can't get in the middle of this unless there is a middle to get into. There was something solid happening with sides already drawn, and I was standing alone on one of them without knowing it. What Diane did tell me, carefully in fragments, was that Daniel had been involved in conversations with Rachel's solicitor about the estate. Not after the wedding. Before it. Months before it. Daniel, who had been dating my sister for 18 months, had inserted himself into a legal process involving land that had belonged to my father. The development plans for those 3 acres were already drafted. I found the planning application online that afternoon, submitted 6 weeks after Dad's funeral, 2 signatures on the form, Rachel's and Daniel's, at a time when Daniel had not yet proposed to my sister but had apparently already co-signed documents relating to her inheritance. The wedding wasn't a wedding. It was a closing ceremony. Everything was already decided, already signed, already in motion. The guest list, the seating, the group chat, the wrong parking information, none of it was careless. It was containment. Keep me confused, keep me isolated, get me into that room surrounded by people already briefed against me, and make sure that by the end of the night I was either silent or discredited. I was supposed to sit at table 11, smile and disappear. I stopped being afraid that afternoon. I started being angry instead. I arrived at the venue 40 minutes early. Not because I was eager. Because I wanted to see the room before anyone could arrange me into a corner. The venue was a converted Victorian manor house, the kind with too many mirrors and not enough exits. I parked in the correct car park, the one I'd found myself, and sat in my car for 6 minutes watching staff carry flower arrangements through a side door. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked deliberate. I got out, smoothed my dress, and walked in. The woman at the welcome table checked my name against a printed list. She found it, paused for half a second longer than necessary, smiled and handed me a program. I looked at the program cover walking away. Rachel and Daniel's names in gold script. A photo of them on a beach somewhere warm, both laughing with their heads back. Rachel looked genuinely happy in it. That was the hardest part. I folded the program and put it in my clutch. The room was filling slowly. I recognized faces in clusters, Rachel's university friends on the left, Daniel's family occupying the right side in matching shades of navy. Our family scattered in between, gravitating toward each other the way relatives do at events where the seating hasn't started yet, and nobody knows where to put their hands. I spotted my mother near the floral arch. She saw me at the same moment. She smiled. It was the smile she used at Dad's work functions when she needed to appear unbothered. She crossed the room and kissed my cheek and told me I looked lovely, and immediately started talking about the centerpieces. I let her talk. I watched her eyes. She didn't once ask how I was. She didn't mention Rachel. She steered me gently toward a drinks table, handed me a glass of something sparkling, and within 90 seconds had introduced me to Daniel's aunt from Bristol, effectively parking me in a conversation I couldn't easily leave. It was smooth. It was practiced. I drank the sparkling water and smiled at Daniel's aunt and thought, my mother has been coached. Rachel appeared 20 minutes before the ceremony. Bride's entrance, everyone turning. The low collective sound a room makes when someone looks the way Rachel looked. She was stunning. I won't pretend otherwise. White dress, simple cut, hair pinned up with a few pieces left loose. She moved through the room hugging people and I watched her path. She greeted her university friends. She embraced Daniel's mother for a long time. She stopped to fix a small child's hair ribbon. She worked the room in a wide arc that brought her within 10 feet of me twice without making eye contact once. I stood there holding my glass and understood with complete clarity that this was also intentional. Then someone tapped my shoulder. I turned expecting a relative. It was a man I didn't recognize, mid-40s, dark suit, small silver pin on his lapel. He smiled pleasantly and introduced himself as the venue's events coordinator. He said he just wanted to check I'd found my seat, confirm I was comfortable, and let me know that table 11 had been slightly repositioned toward the rear wall to allow better flow for the catering staff. He said it the way someone says something they've been asked to say, measured, polite, without quite meeting my eyes. They had moved my table further back. On the morning of the wedding, someone had made that call specifically. I thanked him. He nodded and walked away. I watched him cross the room and stop briefly near Daniel, who glanced over at me once, expression completely flat, then turned back to his conversation. I found my seat. I sat down. The ceremony music started, and I told myself to stay calm for just a few more hours. I almost managed it. The ceremony was 22 minutes long. I counted. I sat in my chair at the back of the room and watched my sister marry a man who had co-signed documents on land that belonged to both of us, and I kept my face completely neutral the entire time. When the officiant said, "Family is the foundation of everything we build," Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. I noticed. Nobody else was looking at him. Everyone was looking at Rachel. But I was looking at Daniel, and Daniel knew it, because halfway through the vows he glanced back once toward the rear of the room and found my eyes immediately, like he'd known exactly where I was sitting the entire time. The reception drinks started on the manor's east lawn. Round trays, white napkins, staff weaving through clusters of guests. I stayed near the edge, close to a stone balustrade, watching the dynamic shift now that the formal part was over. This was the part where people relaxed, where guards came down, where someone always said something they shouldn't. I had learned that at Dad's funeral reception, and I had not forgotten it. Rachel's solicitor was there. I recognized him from a photo I'd found online after Diane's call. He was standing near the rose hedges with a glass of red wine talking to Daniel's father. I had not been told a solicitor would be a wedding guest. I stood very still and watched them talk for 4 minutes. At one point Daniel's father laughed. The solicitor nodded twice and checked his watch. It looked less like a wedding conversation and more like a brief. I was still watching them when Rachel appeared at my elbow. She didn't approach from the front. She came up beside me, close, the way you approach someone when you don't want the conversation visible to the room. She looked straight ahead at the lawn and said quietly, "I'm glad you came." I said nothing. She said, "I need today to go smoothly." Still quiet, still forward-facing, like we were both just watching guests on a lawn. I turned to look at her directly. She didn't turn back. I said, "I found Dad's letter, Rachel." 3 seconds of complete stillness. Then she picked up a canopy from a passing tray, looked at it, set it back down and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." Her voice didn't shake. Her hand didn't shake. She had prepared for this moment. She had rehearsed it. The only thing she hadn't prepared for was what I said next. I told her I had photographed every page. I told her I had already forwarded the photos to an email account she didn't have access to. I told her I had the date, the handwriting, and Dad's signature on a document that directly contradicted the filed will. I said it in the same quiet, forward-facing way she'd started the conversation. 2 women standing at a stone balustrade at a wedding, looking perfectly calm to anyone watching from a distance. Rachel turned to look at me then. Really look. And the expression on her face was not guilt. It was not shock. It was calculation. Pure, cold, instant calculation. She looked at me the way someone looks at a problem they need to solve before a deadline. Then she smiled. Small smile, lips pressed together, and she said, "You've always done this. You've always found a way to make everything about yourself." Then she walked back toward the lawn, touched Daniel's arm once as she passed him and didn't look back. Daniel looked back though, straight at me. Then he took out his phone. 30 seconds later, a man in a dark jacket near the entrance straightened up and started moving in my direction. I hadn't even raised my voice. I hadn't made a scene. I hadn't shown a single person that letter. And they were already mobilizing. He reached me in under a minute. Dark jacket, earpiece, the build of someone paid specifically to move people without breaking anything valuable nearby. He stopped 2 feet in front of me and said, in a voice just loud enough for me to hear, that he'd been asked to escort me from the premises. Not asked to check on me. Not asked to have a conversation. Escort me from the premises. I looked past him toward the lawn. Rachel was already absorbed back into a group of guests, laughing at something, one hand on Daniel's arm. She hadn't even waited to see how it went. I asked him who had made that request. He said he wasn't able to discuss that. I asked him on what grounds I was being removed. He said the event was private, and the hosts had the right to manage their guest list. Their guest list. I had a printed invitation in my clutch with my name on it, spelled wrong by 1 letter, and I was being told this was a managed guest list situation. I pointed that out. He nodded once, patient, unmovable, and gestured toward the side entrance. People were starting to notice. Not the whole lawn, not yet, but the cluster nearest to us had gone quiet. A woman in a yellow fascinator stopped mid-sentence. 2 of Daniel's cousins turned. I saw my mother across the lawn register what was happening, and I watched her make the specific choice to turn her body slightly away and resume her conversation. She didn't take a single step toward me. Not one. I walked. Not because I was defeated. Because fighting a security guard in the middle of a lawn while 200 people watched was exactly what someone had planned for. I could see the architecture of it perfectly in that moment. Push her, isolate her, and if she reacts, she becomes the story. I picked up my clutch, straightened my back, and walked through the side entrance ahead of him. I heard the door close behind us. The lawn noise dropped away. We were in a side corridor, stone floor, 1 window, a fire exit at the end. He stopped there. I stopped. He said he was sorry for any inconvenience, and that I should collect anything I needed from the cloakroom before leaving the building entirely. Inconvenience. My father's land was being developed by a man who'd inserted himself into a will before he'd even proposed to my sister, and this was an inconvenience. I asked him once more directly who had given the instruction. He looked at me for a moment, and something shifted slightly in his expression. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. Like he'd seen this situation before and knew he was standing in the wrong part of it. He said he couldn't say. Then he said, quietly, without the professional tone, "There's a woman. Dark blazer. She spoke to my manager about an hour ago, before guests arrived. Dark blazer." Rachel had been wearing ivory. I ran every woman I'd seen that morning through my memory in about 4 seconds. Daniel's mother. 2 of Rachel's university friends. The events coordinator had been male. Then it landed. The solicitor's companion near the rose hedges. I hadn't focused on her. I'd been watching him. Dark blazer. Standing with the solicitor and Daniel's father during what I now understood was not a casual wedding conversation. I thanked him. He nodded and walked back toward the lawn. I stood alone in that stone corridor with the fire exit in front of me, and the gift I'd placed on table 11 still sitting in that room behind me. $400 dress. A speech nobody asked for. A letter that changed everything. I pushed the fire exit open and stepped outside. The afternoon light hit me hard. A catering van was parked 10 feet away. A staff member on a smoke break looked at me once and looked away. I stood there and I called the one person I should have called 3 weeks ago. My solicitor didn't answer. It was a Saturday. I stood beside a catering van in a $400 dress, leaving a voicemail that I knew sounded more composed than I felt, laying out the letter, the will, the planning application, Daniel's co-signature, the dates, the timeline. I kept my voice flat and factual. When I hung up, I had 17% battery and no portable charger because I'd left it in the car to avoid carrying a bulky bag into a wedding I dressed carefully for. Small decisions compound. I walked toward the car park. I hadn't reached it when the fire exit opened behind me. I turned expecting the security guard. It wasn't him. It was Diane. She was moving fast, heels unsteady on the gravel, one hand holding her dress above her ankles, looking back over her shoulder before she'd even reached me. She grabbed my arm when she got close and said, "Don't leave yet. You need to hear this first." Her mascara was slightly smudged. She'd been crying or close to it. Diane didn't cry easily. I stayed. She pulled me further from the building behind the catering van out of sightline from the windows. Then she talked. Fast, low, no preamble. What she told me in the next 4 minutes reorganized every assumption I'd been operating on. It wasn't just the will. The letter I'd found in the storage unit, Dad's handwritten letter, wasn't the only document. There had been a second meeting with the solicitor 2 weeks before Dad died. Rachel had brought Daniel to that meeting. Dad was on medication at that point, strong medication, the kind that made him compliant and foggy and agreeable. Diane knew because her own mother, our aunt, had been at the hospital that same afternoon and had passed Rachel and Daniel in the corridor outside Dad's room. Our aunt had mentioned it once briefly and then never again. Diane had connected it only recently, after overhearing a phone call between Rachel and Daniel 3 weeks ago that she wasn't supposed to hear. The call had included Rachel saying clearly, "She found something in the storage unit but she doesn't know about the second one." I made Diane repeat that. She did. Word for word. She'd written it down immediately after she'd heard it because even then she knew it mattered. She showed me the note in her phone. Time-stamped. I photographed it standing behind a catering van while a string quartet started playing somewhere inside the building. There was a second document. Something drafted or signed in that final meeting with Dad sedated and Daniel in the room. Something that superseded even Dad's handwritten letter. And Rachel knew I didn't have it. Which meant she wasn't afraid of the letter I'd found. She was confident. That's why the expression on her face at the balustrade hadn't been panic. She'd looked at me like a problem she'd already solved, because as far as she knew, I was holding half the picture and mistaking it for the whole thing. Diane said she didn't know what the second document said. She didn't know where it was filed. She knew the solicitor had been present, she knew Daniel had been there. And she knew Rachel had never once mentioned it to any family member including our mother. I asked Diane why she was telling me this now outside at the wedding. She looked at me and said, "Because 20 minutes ago Daniel told my husband that if you caused a scene today, they were going to tell people you've been harassing Rachel for months over the inheritance. They have screenshots apparently, of messages. I hadn't sent Rachel threatening messages. I hadn't sent Rachel any messages about the inheritance. I'd said 11 words to her about it total quietly, at a stone balustrade 20 minutes ago. The screenshots were fabricated, and they were already prepared, which meant this had never been about the wedding at all." Diane went back inside. She slipped through the fire exit quietly, straightened her dress, and was gone. I stood behind the catering van with a 17% battery, fabricated screenshots, a second document I couldn't locate, and a solicitor who hadn't called back. I walked to my car. Not to leave. To think inside something with a closed door where nobody could watch my face while I worked through it. I sat in the driver's seat and opened my email. The photos I'd sent from the storage unit were there, timestamped 6 weeks ago. I forwarded them again, this time to my personal account and 2 others. Then I opened the planning application I'd found online and screenshot every page. 14% battery. I worked fast. I was halfway through screenshotting the co-signature page when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something stopped me. I answered. It was Daniel. Not Rachel. Daniel. Calling from a number I didn't have, which meant he'd sourced mine specifically for this moment. His voice was calm. Professionally calm, the way people are calm when they've decided the conversation is already over, and they're just delivering the conclusion. He didn't introduce himself. He said, "I think we both know today has gotten out of hand." I said nothing. He continued. He said that Rachel was upset, that the family was upset, and that the best outcome for everyone was if I drove away now, and we all took some time before having any further conversations. He said, further conversations, like we'd been having a disagreement about something minor. Like this was a scheduling conflict. I asked him directly why his name was on a planning application for my father's land 6 weeks after my father's funeral, at a time when he and Rachel were not yet engaged. Complete silence. 3 full seconds of it. Then he said, I'd be very careful about making accusations you can't support. Not a denial. Not an explanation. A warning dressed as advice. I asked about the second meeting with Dad's solicitor. The one where Dad was medicated. Another silence, shorter this time. Then his voice dropped just slightly and he said, You're going to want to stop there. 12% battery. I kept going. I told him I had the planning application screenshots, the time-stamped photos of Dad's letter, a witness to a phone call, and a voicemail already left with my own solicitor. I told him I hadn't come to the wedding to cause a scene. I had come because she was my sister, and I had genuinely tried, until this morning, to believe there was an explanation. His breathing changed on the line. Small shift, barely audible, but I heard it. Then he said something I was not prepared for. He said, Rachel isn't the one you need to worry about. I asked him what that meant. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he said that certain paperwork had been filed that morning. Not related to the estate. Related to me. I asked what paperwork. He said his legal team had submitted a harassment complaint with supporting evidence, and that if I remained on or near the venue property, they would be calling the police to enforce a requested removal. This morning. He had filed paperwork this morning. On his wedding day. Which meant this wasn't reactive. This wasn't a response to me finding the letter or confronting Rachel at the balustrade. This had been filed before I arrived. Before I said a single word to anyone. I hung up. 10% battery. My hands were steady. My mind was completely clear in the way it gets when fear finishes and something colder replaces it. I looked up at the manor house through my windshield. Through the tall windows I could see the reception had moved inside. Chandelier light. Moving shapes of guests. My phone rang again. Different unknown number. I answered immediately. It was my solicitor. My solicitor had gotten the voicemail. She'd listened to it twice. Her first question wasn't about the letter or the will or the planning application. It was, Are you still on the property? I said yes. She said, Get everything you told me in writing to me tonight, every document, every screenshot, every date, and do not engage with anyone else at that venue. I told her about Daniel's call, about the harassment complaint filed that morning. She went quiet in the specific way lawyers go quiet when something has confirmed a suspicion. Then she said, They filed this morning because they needed you removed before you could speak to witnesses at the event. A wedding is the one place your entire family is gathered in one room. They couldn't risk that. I hadn't thought of it that way. I'd been thinking about the humiliation of being removed. She was thinking about the legal architecture. The harassment complaint wasn't designed to protect Rachel. It was designed to clear the room of the one person who could start connecting dots in front of witnesses. 8% battery. I told her about the second document. About Dad's medication. About Daniel being present at that final solicitor meeting. She said, Don't move your car. Don't leave. I need you exactly where you are, with your timestamped location active on your phone. I turned location services on. 7%. She said she was making 2 calls and would ring me back within 15 minutes. I put the phone face up on my dashboard and watched the battery icon. 12 minutes later, 2 things happened almost simultaneously. A police car turned into the venue car park, and my phone died. I watched the car park slowly. No sirens, no urgency. The way police arrive when they've been called to manage a civil situation rather than respond to an emergency. 2 officers. They parked near the main entrance. I sat completely still in my car 3 rows back watching. 1 officer stayed near the vehicle. The other walked toward the entrance and spoke briefly to the doorman, who pointed, not toward the car park, not toward me, but back inside the building. They weren't coming for me. They were going inside. I got out of my car. I needed to see. I moved toward the entrance, staying to the side, close to the hedge line. Through the main doors, which were propped open for the catering staff, I could hear the reception noise, music, conversation, glass, and then cutting through it, raised voices. Not mine. I was outside. These were voices from deep inside the room. One of them was Daniel's. I recognized the cadence even from the entrance corridor. Sharp, clipped, the professionally calm voice gone entirely. The officer who had gone inside came back out within 4 minutes. He was on his radio. He looked across the car park once, scanning, and his eyes landed on me standing at the edge of the entrance. He walked over, asked my name. I gave it. He checked something on a small device, nodded slowly and said, "We've had a report this evening that may involve you. I need to ask you a few questions." I said I had a solicitor and she had been trying to reach me. He said that was fine, I wasn't under any obligation, but that things inside had developed in a way that changed the nature of the call they'd received. I asked what had developed. He looked at me steadily and said, "The original complaint against you has been withdrawn. In the last 20 minutes, a separate allegation has been made against the groom." The string quartet had stopped playing inside. The reception noise had dropped to a low murmur. Through the tall windows I could see guests standing still, facing the same direction, the way a crowd looks when something has happened in the center of a room, and nobody knows whether to move toward it or away. Daniel's voice rose once more inside. Then it stopped completely. The second officer went back inside. I stood at the entrance and nobody stopped me from standing there. The doorman had stepped away. The catering staff moving in and out were focused entirely on not making eye contact with anyone. Inside, the reception had collapsed into clusters of people doing the thing crowds do when something official is happening. Pulling back, forming a perimeter around the center of the room, phones appearing at hip level, not quite raised but ready. Daniel was standing near the head table. Rachel was beside him, one hand on his arm, the same position I'd seen her in all afternoon, except nothing about it looked like a wedding anymore. The officer was speaking to Daniel directly. Daniel was shaking his head. Not frantically. Controlled, precise, the same energy he'd had on the phone, except his jaw was tight and he kept glancing sideways toward the solicitor, who was now standing 6 feet back with his arms crossed and an expression I could only describe as professionally absent, the look of a man calculating exposure. Rachel saw me through the window. I don't know exactly when, but at some point during the 60 seconds I stood at that entrance, she found me standing there and her face did something I hadn't seen it do all day. It cracked. Not into tears. Into something rawer than that. Something that looked almost like relief and terror at the same time, which made no sense until later, when I understood what she'd actually been living with. A third person emerged from somewhere near the back corridor. A woman. Plain clothes, lanyard, the purposeful walk of someone who isn't event staff. She spoke briefly to the uniformed officer, handed him something, and he turned back to Daniel and said something short. Daniel stepped back once. The woman in plain clothes said something else. And Daniel, who had been controlled and precise and professionally calm through everything, looked at the floor for 3 full seconds. Then he looked up at Rachel. Rachel took her hand off his arm. That single movement, her hand dropping away, stepping back half a step, said more than anything that had been said in the last 4 hours. Daniel watched her step back. Something went through his face that I couldn't fully read from where I was standing, but it wasn't surprise. It looked closer to resignation, like a man who had run a very complex calculation for a very long time and had just reached the final number. He was walked out through the main entrance 2 minutes later. Not roughly. No struggle. One officer beside him, plainclothes woman on the other side, moving through the door in the matter-of-fact way that is somehow worse than drama. Guests parted. Someone near the back started crying. One of Daniel's female relatives, hand over her mouth. His father stood completely rigid near the bar, glass still in hand, not moving. Daniel passed within 4 feet of me at the entrance. He didn't look at me. He looked straight ahead, jaw set, and walked to the police car with the specific posture of a man who had prepared for this possibility, and was now executing the contingency. That calculation I'd seen him doing all day. It hadn't just been about me. He'd been running numbers on multiple outcomes simultaneously. The harassment complaint, the estate documents, whatever the plainclothes officer had just handed over. He'd been managing variables. One of them had collapsed. I found out later what the plainclothes officer had brought. A financial crimes unit had been making separate inquiries into Daniel's development company for 11 months. Fraudulent planning applications. Forged co-signatures. My father was not his first. Rachel had not known the full extent of it. She had known enough, but not all of it. And there is a specific kind of devastation reserved for the moment you realize the person you married to secure your future has been using you as a document. Rachel was still standing at the head table when I walked back inside. Nobody moved toward Rachel immediately. The room held its breath for a long moment, 200 people suspended between the impulse to comfort and the instinct to distance. Then her mother-in-law walked out through the main entrance without speaking to anyone. Daniel's father set his glass down on the bar and followed her. The solicitor was gone. I hadn't seen him leave, he'd simply ceased to be present, the way people with legal exposure disappear from rooms. Diane crossed toward Rachel first. Then two of Rachel's university friends. I stayed near the entrance and watched my sister fold into a group of people consoling her at her own wedding reception while her husband sat in a police car outside. I drove home at 9:17 that evening. I know the exact time because my phone had charged enough in the car to turn back on, and the first thing that loaded was a message from my solicitor sent 40 minutes earlier saying she needed to speak to me first thing Monday and to document everything before I slept. I did. I sat at my kitchen table in the $400 dress and typed a 12-page chronological account of every date, every conversation, every document, every name. I finished at 2 in the morning. I slept 4 hours. I woke up and read it back and added 3 things I'd forgotten. Rachel called on Sunday evening. I let it ring. She called again 20 minutes later. I let it ring again. On the third call I answered not because I was ready but because waiting felt worse. She didn't cry on the phone. Her voice was flat and exhausted in the way voices get after a long day of crying when there's nothing left. She said, "I didn't know about the other applications." I said nothing. She said, "I knew about Dad's will. I knew it wasn't right. But I didn't know what Daniel had done beyond that." I still said nothing. She said, "I'm sorry." 2 words. 11 letters. For 31 years and a storage unit and a group chat and table 11 and a security guard and fabricated screenshots prepared before I'd even arrived. I told her I'd be speaking to a solicitor on Monday. I told her I wasn't calling the police on her personally and that any legal action would be civil, not criminal, at least as far as I was involved. She exhaled. I told her that exhale wasn't relief she'd earned. Then I hung up. The civil proceedings took 14 months. The estate dispute was settled out of court with a financial agreement I'm not able to discuss in detail. What I can say is that the 3 acres were not developed. The planning application was voided as part of the financial crimes investigation into Daniel's company, which expanded significantly in the months following the arrest. For other families came forward. My father was not the only elderly man whose final months had included a visit from Daniel and a solicitor and paperwork signed under circumstances that didn't bear scrutiny. Our mother called me twice during the 14 months. Both calls were short. She didn't apologize. She spoke about Rachel, about how hard things were for Rachel, about whether I could find it in myself to be understanding. I was understanding of exactly one thing. That my mother had known something was wrong and had chosen the version of events that required less courage. I told her that on the second call. She hasn't called since. Diane and I spoke regularly throughout. She gave a formal statement. It cost her a significant amount of family comfort and she did it anyway. Some people show you who they are in the quiet moments before the crisis. Diane showed me during it. That distinction matters. Rachel's marriage was annulled 8 months after the wedding. I found out through a cousin's text message. 3 words. It's been annulled. I put my phone down and made a cup of tea and stood at my kitchen window for a while. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been proven right about something they desperately wish they'd been wrong about. It has been 2 years since I stood outside that manor house in a $400 dress watching my brother-in-law get walked to a police car. 2 years since the string quartet stopped playing and the chandelier light caught 200 frozen faces, and my sister's hand dropped from Daniel's arm. 2 years and I still sometimes wake up at 3 in the morning and lie there reassembling the timeline. Finding the moments where I could have moved faster, spoken sooner, pushed harder. Then I get up and make coffee and remind myself that I did move. Just not in the direction anyone had scripted for me. The house sold 18 months ago. My share came through on a Tuesday morning, deposited quietly into an account Rachel's solicitor had no access to. I sat with my phone in my hand looking at the number for a long time. It wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about a handwritten letter at the bottom of a box, shaky, slow handwriting. A man who wanted both his daughters to have something when he was gone. That's what had been taken. Not a financial asset. A decision my father made with whatever clarity he had left, in the final months of his life, trying to be fair to both of us. That's what Rachel and Daniel had buried under legal paperwork and sedation and co-signatures and a group chat I was never added to. I've thought a lot about what Rachel actually believed she was doing. Not Daniel. Daniel knew exactly what he was doing. Every step, every document, every calculated silence on a phone call. But Rachel. I think she told herself a version of events where she deserved more, where I had somehow already received more in ways she couldn't quantify, where the inheritance was a correction rather than a theft. People are extraordinary at constructing justifications that let them sleep. Rachel slept fine for a long time. I know because I called her on random evenings during that year and she always sounded rested. She doesn't sound rested now. We have spoken 4 times in 2 years. Short, careful conversations with long silences where the old version of us used to be. She is living in a flat in a city 2 hours away. She works. She doesn't date as far as I know. She asked me once on the 3rd call if I thought she was a bad person. I told her I thought she'd made bad choices and let a bad person make worse ones on her behalf. She was quiet for a long time after that. I don't know if it helped her. I said it because it was the most honest thing I had. My father's rings are on my dressing table. The ones from the wrong envelope, the note addressed to Rachel that ended up with me. I've never given them to her. I've never thrown them away. They sit there and I look at them sometimes and think about a man who taped a brown envelope shut at the bottom of a box, corners folded down neatly, because he wanted to make sure it survived long enough for someone to find it. He knew one of us would look. He knew because he raised us and he understood, probably better than either of us did, exactly what was coming. He left me the letter because he trusted me to do something with it. I did. If you are sitting on something right now, a document, a conversation, a gut feeling that something isn't right, I am not going to tell you what to do with it. What I will tell you is this. The people who build systems to silence you are always most afraid of the simplest thing. Not lawyers. Not evidence. Not confrontation. A person who refuses to sit quietly at table 11 and disappear. That's all I was. That was enough.